Thank you so much. Welcome to the session on Southeast Asia. Obviously, we don't have much audience here, but I feel sorry for the people who joined the other session on the first floor, because we can enjoy our discussion as well as this beautiful scenery outside. So it's a beautiful afternoon, and good afternoon for all. Just as a beginning, I have to say that Mr. Nisid Hazari was supposed to be the moderator for this session. He couldn't make it this time, so I had to replace him as a moderator as well as a speaker. But given our four experts on Southeast Asian issues, I would reduce my time for talking, and I will give more time to our honored four speakers. Okay, let me just introduce our panelists just briefly, because their name is like their CV. So every expert on Southeast Asia knows their expertise and their past careers only by their name. But our first speaker is Mr. Ernest Bower. He is President and CEO of BowerGroupAsia. It is a business advisory company focused on Asia. And surprisingly, he's got a Datuk from Malaysia, so you can call him Datuk Bower. Well, our second speaker, Adriana Elisabeth from Indonesia. She's a senior political analyst, Center for Political Studies, Indonesian Institute of Sciences, or we can call this institute LIPI in Indonesia. Okay, our third speaker, Tan Sri Mohamed Jawhar. He was former chairman of Institute of Strategic and International Studies, Malaysia, or called ISIS Malaysia. And last but not the least, our fourth speaker, Mr. Ravi Velloor, associate editor and columnist with the Straits Times. Okay. Let me just briefly explain the background of this session. Obviously, we are talking about Southeast Asia and the liberal international order. I kind of have three keywords here that I got when I go through this panel description. First, ASEAN centrality, and second, ASEAN unity, and some domestic challenges. There are a number of domestic challenges going on in Southeast Asia at the moment when it comes to the liberalism or liberal order. Some challenges to democracy, human rights, and all that. For example, in Thailand, still under military rule. And as you know, there is a grave human rights violation going on in Myanmar. And some other countries, they have domestic issues which goes against liberal political tradition. And the first one, ASEAN centrality. ASEAN centrality has been kind of a buzzword for ASEAN countries as well as ASEAN collectively. And I believe this concept of ASEAN centrality is basically based on multilateral cooperation and institutions in the region. Because ASEAN is central to the ARF, ASEAN Plus 3, and East Asia Summit. So given the current situation when these multilateral institutions in East Asia is getting weaker and weaker, and it does not get so much attention as it did before today. So given the weakening regional multilateral institutions, then ASEAN centrality, where the ASEAN centrality goes and what is the future of ASEAN centrality. And on top of that, we have a new trend coming into the region, like the Chinese One Belt and One Road initiative, as well as US-led Indo-Pacific initiative. These big powers initiative in the region make the space for ASEAN centrality narrower and narrower. So one of the big questions is how the ASEAN countries can expand its space and strengthen the concept of ASEAN centrality. And what is closely related to the concept of ASEAN centrality is the concept of ASEAN unity. I heard that Joseph Liu earlier session on Indo-Pacific, he mentioned there is a few consensus among Southeast Asian countries, but much more disagreement among Southeast Asian countries. Anyway, based on this ASEAN unity, ASEAN has been punching above its weight in international stages, and it has been a great asset for Southeast Asian countries. But in recent years, obviously, Southeast Asian countries individually pulled in different directions, especially as I mentioned, affected by these powers' new initiative like Indo-Pacific and the Belt and Road Initiative. Okay, just my brief background explanation, and I would like to immediately invite our first speaker, Mr. Bower, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you for coming today. It's really nice to be in Seoul, and I'm very happy to see the sun out after a day of rain and some clouds, but it's a beautiful city, and I'd like to thank you, Doctor, and thank the Asan Institute for inviting me. I really appreciate it. When you think about the 21st century, the geopolitical bullseye, the center of gravity of geopolitical importance, where the action is in the globe, economically, security-wise, in terms of people and innovation, is really going to be where the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Oceans meet. And that brings us right to Southeast Asia. So I would argue from a geopolitical or geographic perspective, Southeast Asia is going to be central. I also think that ASEAN and the ASEAN way, which has been so frustrating to many who study hard power and probably all the people up in the room at the Northeast Asia session and the guys who do hardcore security, they probably think that the ASEAN way is too soft and too non-binding, not something that is immediately relevant to solving today's economic and security problems. I would argue the other way. I actually think that ASEAN's approach, the consensus building, the fact that ASEAN doesn't have binding commitments necessarily to one another, it makes it an open space where all the world's powers meet and compete, and they can talk. And I think that you will see, even in the case of Korea and the summitry that's coming up, I think Southeast Asia may play an important role in the Trump Kim Jong-un meeting, for instance. I think that Southeast Asia will be a very important in terms of economic integration in Asia. And I would argue to you that economic integration is the fundamental, most important story of the 21st century for not only for Asia, but for the world. Asian economic integration, how that goes, if it goes smoothly, if countries are able to invest in one another and trade with one another, if TPP and RCEP move forward, I think we'll have a relatively peaceful and prosperous international economy driven and led by Asia. If that's not the case, if that's contested, if we break up into groups of countries, if we go towards regionalism, I think that we will have conflict, and I think that even the U.S. Secretary of Defense, the last U.S. Secretary of Defense, before he made his first Asia trip, said that he'd rather have TPP than another aircraft carrier. And the reason he said that was Ash Carter, The reason he said that was that that economic cooperation, raising the level of commitments to free trade and to work with each other is fundamental to the security of the region. So ASEAN centrality is important. Whether we recognize it or not, it will become more important in the 21st century. I would say that regionalism has had a great opportunity in the last 5 years to jump ahead. President Obama in the United States made a commitment to participate in regional organizations at a level that no U.S. president had before. He joined the East Asia Summit. He signed the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation with ASEAN. He actually showed up to all but one of the East Asia Summit and APEC meetings. I think that the underlying belief there was that this cooperation, this ASEAN centrality, was very important. And I think, despite President Trump's unpredictability, his rhetoric, some of his personal politics, the fact that the national security plan for Asia is articulated as an Indo-Pacific plan, it indicates that the Americans, at least at a high-level policy approach, understand that this idea that I'm talking about, that the real center of gravity, the question of how will the rest of Asia balance a rising China, is got to do with ASEAN centrality and ASEAN structures. I would argue too that countries, including the ASEAN countries themselves, in fact, I would say ASEAN has undercut itself on purpose because the ASEAN countries compete with one another. But the ASEAN countries have failed to invest in ASEAN as an institution. They have purposely kept the ASEAN Secretariat relatively weak, underfunded it, treated old rules about contributions as a rule where they've been flexible on ASEAN rules like 10-X and other areas where they wanted to move forward on trade and other things, but they haven't done that in terms of building ASEAN as an institution. That has not helped other countries, partners of ASEAN, invest in ASEAN and take it seriously. And I think it really behooves Singapore, who is the chair of ASEAN this year, to try to step that up. Now, Singapore has not always been a great friend of ASEAN. In fact, you would argue in some ways Singapore has purposely kept ASEAN relatively weak. But I think the ASEAN countries know that ASEAN has a very important role to play. And I think they will come of an age, we're not there yet, they will come of a realization that strengthening ASEAN is very important. I think the fact that many countries have put ambassadors in Jakarta to be ambassadors to ASEAN, the United States, Japan, others have done this, is an indication of what's to come. And Jakarta and ASEAN will become, I believe, a more important nexus of Asian economic integration and in security discussions through the ASEAN Defense Ministers +3. I would also make a couple of recommendations. I think that APEC is also important. APEC should have ASEAN at its core. The fact that Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar are not members of APEC is inexcusable. The fact that India is not a member of APEC, in my view, is inexcusable. This is due to, I think, old-fashioned ideas about bureaucratics, and it's an old-fashioned bureaucratic commitment to the lines that separate East Asia from South Asia, which practically don't exist if you're in business or if you are investing in people. Those lines don't exist. They're being perpetuated by bureaucracies that have sort of an anachronistic approach to regionalism. So I'm probably going to be an outlier on this panel. I think ASEAN centrality is the future. I think that ASEAN unity will ebb and flow naturally. Right now, it's extremely low. It's every man for himself in a lot of ways. There'll be lip service to ASEAN, and the Singaporeans, I think, will do a good job of running the process this year. But the truth is that until the ASEAN countries work through some of their own domestic politics, like the ties you mentioned have been focused internally. Indonesia has elections in 2019. The Filipinos have great concern. Some have great concern about where they're headed in terms of governance. Malaysia has an election coming up in 10 days or so. But I think the countries will, when they take stock of where they're going in terms of trade, when they take stock of their security future, will make a deeper investment in ASEAN. And I think when the Americans and the Japanese and the Indians and the Chinese get serious, they will also understand that ASEAN centrality is key. I believe that ASEAN has been undercut by the Chinese on purpose, particularly because of the South China Sea and sovereignty issues. And I would have thought that ASEAN would have responded with more strength than it has. But the Chinese have been very good at undercutting ASEAN centrality and ASEAN unity, probably more ASEAN unity. And I think they've done that for their own domestic interests. But I think that will be overcome. And in 10 years from now, we will be the most important meetings will be taking place around the East Asia Summit and ASEAN-related ministerial meetings, including the defense ministers, the economic ministers, and others. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much. As a moderator in this session, my most important role is the timekeeping. But I didn't mention how much time for each speakers, but basically 7 to 8 minutes for each speakers, and then after all presentation, we will go for another round, and then we can get some questions or comments from the floor. Okay, let me invite Elisabeth, Adriana.
Yeah. Okay. First of all, thanks for inviting me here. I've been listening to many topics since yesterday, and I'm finding difficulties to digest all of the information, the shares. But I just want to bring you to more specific issues in ASEAN, probably my experience from the ground. This is related to the ASEAN centrality, especially it's also influenced by the domestic conditions in ASEAN in each member countries. So a few years ago, I had a research on the implementation of democracy and human rights. So again, back to the topic of this conference about liberal international order. So I think ASEAN has been implementing all the universal principles regarding democracy and human rights. But again, in reality, it's not easy for ASEAN to implement in the context of each member country. Let's say simply I can categorize ASEAN in 3 different groups which has been implementing democracy more properly, like Indonesia, Thailand, and also the Philippines. But again, if we look down in each country, so there are more dynamic situations there. The second group of semi-democratic country in ASEAN, let's say Singapore, Malaysia, and probably Brunei Darussalam. The rest of ASEAN members associated with the still in authoritarian regime. But this is actually what I want to make an evaluation questions. Is it true or not, or is it proper or not to say that ASEAN has been practicing illiberal international order by saying that probably some of the members are not successfully enough to know how to implement all the universal principles? The other question is, there's always pros and cons about either democracy is related to human rights, or we can assess that partially. This is also the continuous debate in ASEAN. Related to that is also always come to a question, which must come first, economy or democracy? So this is always something related to the dynamics in ASEAN. And regarding the concept in relation to what the US and also China have been proposing, like in relation to Indo-Pacific and also Belt and Road Initiative, I think we also have to ask the US and China, how are they treating small countries like ASEAN, except Singapore probably? If I make an example, Indo-Pacific of the US heavily in military approach compared to a free and open Indo-Pacific from Japan, which is more on economic connectivity. Belt and Road Initiative probably combined both approaches. But if I may ask about how the US and China have been mapping to all the potential of the region in Southeast Asia regarding the richness of the natural resources. So probably this is a big question to all of us. So talking about free trade, what kind of trade do we do? Because one of the trade commodity is coming from the natural resources, let's say energy. And no single panelist in this conference talking about how to manage the natural resources properly, because talking about free trade and etc. So without any concern to manage the natural resources in this region, so I think this is nonsense. So again, back to the illiberal international order, if we see from the ASEAN context. So probably one important element is how we think together to properly manage the natural resources in this region. Probably this is my first comments on this. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
It's interesting to point out the regional management of resources and all that. Okay, now let me invite Tan Sri Jawhar for his comment.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. Very good afternoon. Welcome to everyone. First of all, I'd like to congratulate ASEAN on its 10th anniversary. This is a great achievement. It's, if not the leading, one of the leading institutes in South Korea. And I would like to thank Dr. Lee, the Institute, for inviting me to this forum. I think the points with which Dr. Lee raised and which my fellow panelists addressed just now. And first on the liberal, illiberal international order. I'm with Joseph in the previous, that for us, what's important is a rules-based order. In terms of the rules-based order, it has been modifying itself ever since this thing came into existence. To me, this rules-based order or liberal international order, which perhaps in the Northeast you would like to call it, it starts from the Treaty of Westphalia, which laid down the rules. It has its ups and downs. But it has been shifting. Recent three inflection moments were post-World War II, unipolar moment for US, and the UN Charter, etc. And then another inflection point was when the Soviet Union collapsed. And the third inflection point is now when the global geoeconomic, geopolitical balance is being shifted. And it cannot but have an impact on the rules-based order or the liberal international order, as we would like to call it, as the international order has been shifting through the last 2 centuries, it will shift now. It will shift now, I believe, to reflect new power balance that's emerging, and there'll be perhaps in terms of international economic institutions more weightage to China in the World Bank, etc. And possibly China will come out with some new things which will have the Asian International Development Bank, Investment Bank, etc. Right. So these things will reflect the changes, and this will be the new international order or emerging international order, which in some ways will be more inclusive. In other ways will reflect more a greater Chinese influence. For instance, non-intervention, non-interference will be more emphasized in this order, although China itself will interfere a little bit, and we'll come to that later. So anyway, that's the rules-based order that I would like to call it. And in this regard, I would like to say that ASEAN is one of the most, one of the best adherents to the rules-based order, not only in words, but also in deeds. In terms of word, if you look at the ASEAN Declaration when it was first established, if you look at the ASEAN Charter, ASEAN Vision 2025, etc., and all the other, in fact, all the other instruments, including the economic instruments, they all stress what the liberal international order would like to stress, which is peace through dialogue. And if you go back to the classic international order, non-intervention, Treaty of Westphalia, sovereignty, non-intervention, etc., and dialogue, settlement of disputes peacefully through arbitration, etc. That's on the political side. And on the economic side, free market, open trading system, integration, etc., multilateralism. All these are stressed by ASEAN in its documents, but I think even more important when we talk about the liberal international order or rules-based order is whether you abide by it or not. Or is it just words, and only when it suits you, you go along with it, and when you feel it's against your interests, then you intervene here, intervene there. In this sense, I think ASEAN has been also abiding by a rules-based order, if only because, I don't know, maybe we are not powerful enough. Powerful countries, they exert themselves more. So that is in terms of liberal international order. But coming to more closely to ASEAN itself and some of the challenges it faces, I agree with Ernest, Dr. Adriana, etc. I think for ASEAN, ASEAN is critically important, not only for ASEAN, but for the whole wider region. We will know that when there is no ASEAN. When we poo-poo ASEAN, for the time being, everybody is here, but if you neglect ASEAN, and including the ASEAN countries themselves, I think there'll be a big price to pay. But having said that, I must say that if you want to move Southeast Asia forward, including in the political security dimension, you have to look at the individual digits, the members. If you want to push Southeast Asia, ASEAN, make it progress further, the emphasis should be on the individual members. They should be the ones who, in driving themselves, will be driving ASEAN. Because ASEAN is not as integrated as EU, etc. The center of gravity is in the states, the members. So if, for instance, Malaysia improves economically, improves politically, etc., it will be a contribution to ASEAN. Similarly for the other countries. So because we are less integrated as a regional organization, it's the individual members that will be the drivers of ASEAN. And it is in the individual countries that we would look at how they perform. I'll come to that later. Second, as I said, while the individual countries will be where the action would be, ASEAN is very critical. And in this regard, I would like to highlight 3 points, which will also, impinge into the domestic sphere. First, we should, as ASEAN has done, if you look at the ASEAN Charter, if you look at ASEAN Vision 2025, etc., 2050 and all that, they all emphasize exactly what the liberal international order would want. Everything is there. Whether it's a democracy, although there is a democracy deficit, whether it's governance, corruption, rule of law, open market, etc., they are all there. All the words, you'll be hard put from the liberal international order perspective to add anything to these things. But when we come to the implementation, ASEAN, through its individual members especially, can do a lot more. And the first thing they would have to look at is governance. Now, to me, good governance. Good governance to me, I'd like to emphasize that good governance to me includes democracy. And and good governance that includes democracy is more important than democracy per se. Very often we talk about democracy, 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 without really looking at the other aspects of good governance, and that is where we tend to fail. Countries tend to fail. They are failed democracies. But there are good governance countries which, even if there are some, they could do better in the democratic field, they do so well in the other fields. Singapore is a good, shining example of this. Now, of course, Singapore can improve on its democracy aspect, but only 4 countries in the world, or 5, beat Singapore in terms of human development. They are number 5. In terms of corruption, only 4 or 3 beat Singapore in the global corruption perception index. So I think that these are fundamental, and Singapore is one of the most developed economically, I'm talking, countries in the world. So we should not while democracy is very important and we value it very highly, there are other elements that are important, and this is very important to a Southeast Asia where political systems are diverse. So first is good governance. Second, or better governance, a more equitable and sustainable economic growth. This is also very relevant in Southeast Asia, and this is what the liberal international order talks about. But unfortunately, not only ASEAN, the rest of the world has not been doing in terms of equitable, sustainable, inclusive growth. ASEAN is no exception. This is perhaps part of the reason, a product of the capitalist system, market system, whatever it is. But ASEAN has to address these differences among the members, which ASEAN has got plans for and all that, and which we have been doing, but within countries itself, where gaps are growing. So this has to be addressed. Third, security. Security, essentially for ASEAN, I think, in terms of interstate relations, we are doing very, very well. And we have to thank Indonesia a lot for that. Because it's half of ASEAN is Indonesia, but Indonesia has chosen the peaceful path, engagement path, musyawarah, muafakat path, and therefore we have a very good story to tell there. And this is a good example for Northeast Asia, for instance. But at the same time, internally, we have many weaknesses. We are fragile, nation building, etc. We tend to forget, we think, we are already over that. But actually, Myanmar is nation building in, very acute, with acute problems. I would say Thailand has acute problems with regard to nation building, among others, because of the problem in the south. So it is with Philippines. They have not been able to come together. So I think this is part nation building and security. Security, the Rohingya problem, southern Thailand problem, southern Philippines problem, etc. So it is in terms of governance, I would like to highlight that. First, to address the human development aspect. As far as human development aspect, we only have 2 countries very high human development, Singapore and Brunei. High, Malaysia, Thailand. The rest are medium high. We have to work very hard to elevate those in the medium-high element. And this is liberal, international order. And this is what ASEAN stands for. We are becoming, incidentally, the assessment is that by 2025, ASEAN will be, collectively speaking, the 5th largest economy in the world. By 2050, the 4th largest. And that may address some of the concerns Ernest has, etc. Perhaps when we have more economic weight, we also will develop more gravitas and credibility, etc. Now, the other aspect still with governance is corruption. Corruption, Singapore is an outlier in the positive sense. It's number 6, the latest corruption index. Brunei is not bad. Malaysia, the only 3 ASEAN members in the upper half of 180 entities. There's Singapore, there's Brunei, there's Malaysia. Although Malaysia is facing problems, as you all know, but still it's in the upper half. The rest of ASEAN's members are in the lower half. And I must say, Indonesia is doing very well. But considering where it came from and the challenges it faces, it's still, in the second half. But in terms of civil political rights, none of us are free. None of the ASEAN members are free. Now, the most free is Indonesia, and second is Philippines, quite rightly, as Dr. Adriana pointed out. But in terms of the Freedom House Index Political Civil Rights, which divides into 3, free, partly free, not free, half of ASEAN, none are free, half of ASEAN is partly free, half of ASEAN is not free. So we have a lot of work to do if we want the ASEAN community, especially the political security community, to develop. So these are the things I'd like to, in terms of ASEAN credibility, integration, of course, cohesion, etc., the community building aspect. Finally, and I would like to underline what Ernest said about ASEAN being more credible, strengthen its institutions, including the Secretariat, etc. The final point is in terms of major power rivalry. Now, it's sad to see that major power rivalry is growing. The primary driver of this is, of course, China. Not because it wants major power rivalry, but by its rise, it's upsetting the balance in the region, etc. And the other, especially major powers, are responding to this. And China has sometimes, walks with a heavy foot, especially with smaller countries, as has been stated just now. So this is, making the major power rivalry more intense, and it is showing itself in various ways, including in the Indo-Pacific concept. Now, we heard earlier session, Indo-Pacific, they said how, especially Australia explained it, US explained it, it's coercive, etc., not military, this, that. But if you look at the US Defense Department's security assessment, I can quote from it. It's much of this Indo-Pacific thing is military, with China and other emerging powers. Now, ASEAN is caught in this. We also heard, and Joseph mentioned this, that ZOPFAN, the neutrality thing, of course, is nothing much. But I would like to argue that it is becoming more relevant now. ZOPFAN was conceived in a time when there was great power conflict. It was during the Cold War. And it made a lot of sense for Southeast Asia, which had been under the thumb of various colonial, Japanese, etc. powers, that for you not to get involved, stay away from major power rivalry and conflict. So ZOPFAN made a lot of sense. But it has been misunderstood. Misunderstood in the sense that, that means we shouldn't get close to any big powers. No, it only meant we should not get involved in their conflicts. We should get close to any and all powers, especially the major powers. And we have done that very well in terms of investment, good relations, etc. But now that there is a resurgence of major power rivalry, I think it makes a lot of sense for the members of ASEAN. We all have our some of us are slightly more on this side, some of us are slightly more on that side, but nevertheless, to stay as much as possible out of the way of major power rivalry, douse major power rivalry sparks that come into our region, and not to become easily induced by this power or that power, and I mean especially China. I'd like to stop there. I think I've spoken too much.
Thank you, Tansi. You mentioned a lot about the liberal international order in Southeast Asia and ASEAN, and I will get back to you regarding this liberal international order and the what ASEAN can do to sustain the order in this region in the second round. Okay, let me invite Ravi. Please comment.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Jaehyon. It's wonderful to be here. I come to Korea about twice a year, but it's the first time that I've attended an Asan Plenum, and I feel really privileged that you thought of inviting me from Singapore. I also like to thank my my co-panelists, and particularly Dr. Sri for his kind words on Singapore. There are many kinds of freedoms, but I think freedom from want and freedom from ignorance tops the list, and that's what we tried to fix in Singapore. I have a small issue with Ernest's comments on Singapore's commitment to ASEAN. We are very committed to ASEAN. It's a key plank of our foreign policy. We take it seriously. And if you go back, 10 years ago when we were chair of ASEAN the last time, some of the strongest comments on Myanmar came when Singapore was in the chair. I mean, we expressed revulsion when the Burmese army fired on monks protesting for democracy. And I think, we are committed, maybe more committed than some bigger neighbors these days who don't seem to be that committed. But we are in the chair now, and as you'll see, we hopefully will guide ASEAN back into the centrist path that we used to be before Cambodia happened, and even the Philippines last year. I also want to make a small point of clarification. This subject is about the liberal international order in Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia is a little bit bigger than ASEAN, although I think for convenience it's okay to conflate the two. Those little points aside, let me just say that we are, it would be an understatement to say that, we are living through very interesting, very challenging times in Southeast Asia. And this is a region that has gained perhaps the most from the liberal international order. From the investments that we received with, that we welcomed, that lifted our living standards so much over 30 years, 40 years of peace. The umbrella of security that the United States gave us, under which we flourished, and we could afford to keep our defense budgets down because of that and focus on key things like what Dr. Sri said, education, critical things. And that came with globalization version 1.0, which has worked very well for all of us. But now this is under challenge today, and let me list out a few of the pressure points on Southeast Asia and the liberal international order as it applies to Southeast Asia. And some of them you could say is endogenous. Most of it is endogenous to our region. That is, it is from within our region or in our neighborhood. And there are a couple of factors that are exogenous to our region. So let me start about things that stem from us, from within us. And certainly China's rise and its profile and its current attitude is the biggest challenge that we have. It's good to see a former Korean ambassador to Singapore in the audience. I'm really happy to see you. Back to China. Now, a lot of attention has focused on the South China Sea, on China's behavior in maritime ASEAN. As you know, China is one of the countries that has benefited from the rules-based order. Look at the way they mastered the WTO mechanisms. They're very efficient at using WTO for their own purposes. But when it comes to, the South China Sea, they completely ignored international rules, and they stood up and said, we don't care. We will not participate and we will not abide by the rulings. It's a huge challenge. But as I said, a lot of attention is focused on the maritime part of this challenge, but a equally big challenges playing out in the mainland, and that is along where the Mekong flows all the way from China. It's called the Lanchang in China, and it comes down. And China refuses to become a member of the MRC, the Mekong River Commission. The MRC had a meeting on the 4th of this month. China, for the third time, attended as a dialogue partner, not a member of the MRC. And it is because it feels that it has the right of say in what affects it. Li Keqiang said that in January in Phnom Penh. He said, this concerns our neighborhood, it's a soft underbelly, and we will decide how this region is to be run. And most of us who belong to the so-called liberal world have just stood by and done nothing. The US has its own program, the Indians have their own program, Koreans, I believe, have $1 million, Joseph said, for this region. It's really inadequate. That challenge is being almost ignored. It's almost subsumed in the larger scheme of things. The next point is on Burma, on Myanmar, and the kind of violation of human rights that's going on in Myanmar and against the Rohingya. It is an issue that is dividing ASEAN severely, and it is an issue where our centrality is being affected. Why? Because who are the people who are going into Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh? The Pope himself has shown up there. Mogherini, the EU's high representative for foreign affairs, or whatever it's called, Secretary of State Tillerson. Where is ASEAN in this? I mean, we are losing the initiative on a very important thing that's key to us because, we are not there. And why is this happening? Because we are paying the penalty for two things. If you look at Chinese aggressive behavior in this region and the loss of centrality, the first is that we haven't paid enough attention to history. And why do I say that? If you go back to 1974 and Chinese behavior in the Paracels, they had just reset ties with the United States. The Nixon administration was crumbling, and the Chinese went into the Paracels and picked up, what's it called, Johnson, was it Johnson? Johnson Reef? Mm-hmm. Yeah, 80 Vietnamese soldiers were killed, and they kept it. ASEAN kept quiet because they said, oh, it's none of our business, that's two communist countries fighting, because Vietnam was not a member of ASEAN at that point. Come down further, in 1989, the Chinese decide to teach Vietnam a lesson, and they go in, and they do it at a time when Vietnam's major patron, the Soviet Union, was crumbling. It was thoroughly preoccupied with its own troubles. So you get a blow in the nose. Again, ASEAN kept quiet. Number 3, and this happened to a member of ASEAN. In 1992, the Americans withdrew from Subic and Clark. 1995, one fine morning, President Ramos found that the Chinese had occupied Mischief Reef in the Spratlys. So they said, what's going on? And they asked the Chinese, and the Chinese said, oh, we're just building structures for fishermen to rest. Today, it's a full-fledged military installation. So we're forgetting all this, and then what do we do? And Japan is complicit in this, when we, in the interest of expediency, ignore the rules of the liberal international order, we ultimately pay for it. Let me give you an example. 1989, Tiananmen Square. China is in the doghouse, international doghouse, because of that. Deng Xiaoping reaches out to Konosuke Matsushita, the richest Japanese man at that time, and he says, please come and invest. And, Matsushita was the first big name to invest in China post-Tiananmen. It was a big optical victory for the Chinese to have the richest Japanese investing in that country. And in 2012, when after the nationalization of the Senkakus and there were anti-Japanese violence, all the factories were attacked. It was a Matsushita factory, a Panasonic factory in Shantung that was attacked. That was payback. for a good deed done to them. I mean, how quickly people forget when you're assertive and you're powerful. And the same with ASEAN. In the early 90s, we provided this fig leaf called Asian values. Some of our ASEAN nations were complicit in that. To say that you could maybe not be too, you don't have to obey the rules of the liberal international order. We have to make exceptions for ourselves. We're Asians, we do things differently. But see what's happening to us today, Those of us who provided that cover of Asian values, we are suffering. Ernie pointed out the efforts to systematically divide ASEAN. Now, the Chinese are not against ASEAN economic integration, but they will not allow you to integrate politically. It just does not suit them, and they'll do everything in their power to cut and divide us there. Moving away from political issues, there's another thing that is a pressure point on ASEAN, and that is the three big markets around us: the Chinese, the Indians, each of them more than 1 billion people, and Indonesians, the biggest country in ASEAN. Each of them is actively working to lengthen the supply chains within their own borders. So those of us who thought of a grid system, who dreamt of a grid system for ASEAN, that you make certain parts in Thailand, certain things in Malaysia, and then you assemble them all in Indonesia. Well, what we're seeing is, and if you look at South Korean export numbers to China, you see that. Why is it under pressure? Because the Chinese are doing more and more things within their own borders. Just like that, all these big economies and big markets around us are lengthening the supply chains. And that is affecting us. And today, ASEAN has moderated its ambitions when it comes to economic integration. We used to talk about a single market and production base. Today, the language is being tweaked. We talk about a highly integrated ASEAN economy. Subtle changes, but important changes. Exogenous factors when it comes to pressing on ASEAN, and the first is obviously what happened in Britain last year in Brexit. It is something that has shocked us. I don't know a single ASEAN country, not even a single Asian country, that is happy about what happened in Britain. Some of the bigger countries, China, Japan, Singapore, not big, but influential, all tried to warn against Brexit, saying, you're like Turkey is praying for Christmas, but they went ahead and it's gone one way. The rise of the far right in Germany, today the AfD is the number 2 group in parliament, in German parliament. It's the main opposition group. And then Trump's America. What does that mean? 7 more years of Trump to begin with.
No, that's not
he just finished 1 year. I was in the United States last year, and one of the things I wrote about it when I came back, I spent a month traveling from coast to coast, and what I fear most is the hollowing out of Middle America. Anybody with a liberal mindset has started feeling uncomfortable in Middle America, so they're moving either to the West Coast or the East Coast, the places where the most globalized parts of America, because they don't feel comfortable if you're a liberal to stay in that whole thing from Chicago to the South. What does that mean in the electoral college system? You might have losing candidates who actually get 5 million more of the popular vote, and yet because of the electoral college, you'll have a different kind of president. Maybe a Trump without the sleaze, but similar thinking, who could run America. And what does that mean for us? If the policies of an administration is going to be, it's going to be bigoted or so transactional without a global view, what does that mean for us? And how do we take care of ourselves in that kind of an environment? We have to prepare for that. And finally, Datasri mentioned this, is the deteriorating US-China relationship. It is something that should frighten all of us in Southeast Asia. if you read the national security strategy that was put out recently, I assume that the president hasn't read the whole strategy, but I assume that the one page which carries his signature, I hope he read it. And that one page, I think in the 4th paragraph, it talks about taking China head on. That's the word. That's the phrase, expression used. To take it head on. What does that mean when you take on a country head on? And it's coming to things like, the NSS even talks about the number of Chinese students in America. I mean, it's coming down to that. So if these two countries are going to, have a tense, tough time ahead, where does that leave Southeast Asia? We are dependent on China, and the Chinese never fail to remind us that our prosperity depends on them, although I personally believe that it's overstated. The Chinese need us as much as we need them. The number one investor in China in the last 3 years is not the United States or the European Union, it is Singapore, tiny Singapore. But they have parlayed that narrative very effectively. A good job for them and their diplomacy to make us all feel that we are more dependent on them than they are on us. Well, good luck. I don't want to get into the reasons for Chinese behavior. I don't think they're intrinsically bad people. It is a certain thing, but that we can discuss in Q&A if you like. But for now, we are heading into a different kind of liberal international order with modifications. I don't think the first LIO version 1 is dead, but the version 2, which will come with Globalization 2.0, will look quite different from the first version. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Now we are entering into the second round, and I will ask some questions, one for each panelist. And given our time limits, I hope that you can limit your answer within 5 minutes. And obviously, one of when I explain what ASEAN so far has achieved to my students, I say that the ASEAN is like a glass. If you look ASEAN from this angle, it's half empty, but from different angle, it's half full. There are a lot of shortcomings of ASEAN, but at the same time, there are a lot of achievement and merits that ASEAN has. And my questions to you, the panelists, will focus on those points. And let me start with Ernest Bower, and I will first ask you a question so that you can have time to prepare your answer. And then, okay, for Bower, Mr. Bower, I would like to ask you some question on the ASEAN political security community. If you look at the ASEAN political security community blueprint, there are 3 different sections within individual countries, within ASEAN and external power relations. But funny enough, ASEAN and external power relation got least attention, just a few pages, and the description is not that concrete in that. And if ASEAN wants to establish the political security community of its own, then it has to increase its role and its influence in wider regional security issues. So, is ASEAN doing enough to be a really important player in wider regional political security issues? And if not, how to improve it? That is the question for you. And for Adriana, you mentioned resource management in the region, and for more effective resource management in Indonesia or in other countries, it has to start from ASEAN, within the ASEAN. And you have to, maybe you have to, it's a good idea to set up some kind of, ASEAN, the institution to manage your own resource. But if you look at the ASEAN track record of in managing transnational crimes, transnational environment issues, natural disaster, and what else? Haze. And you have whole range of institutions and regulations and agreements. But the people's assessment on these institutions and agreement, you don't have teeth in ASEAN to implement and enforce these agreements and institutions. So, what is your response to that? The question for Tansri, quite simple. You mentioned a lot on the liberal international order. If I define, I don't have the expertise to define liberal international order in the region, but I can mention a few elements like free trade and multilateralism, democracy, human rights on this point. But if you look at the situation in the region, China is rising as a illiberal sort of revisionist power in the region, and maybe many regional countries had a face in the U.S. as a sort of a protector or anchor for the liberal international order in this region. But given the current Trump administration, our confidence in the U.S. is getting lower and lower, as you can see in the case of the U.S. pulling out from TPP. So, what we can do together, simply, what the ASEAN countries or other regional countries, we all prospered under existing liberal international order in this region, especially free trade. What the regional countries, Australia, Korea, Japan, and ASEAN 10 countries can do together to sustain or strengthen the liberal international order. And for Ravi, I want you to share Singapore wisdom or the ASEAN wisdom, how to live together with these big powers. If you look at the Singapore history, Singapore is surrounded by big countries by ASEAN standard, like Indonesia, Malaysia, and Philippines. And Singapore is, in terms of the size and population and resource, is quite small. But anyhow, it survived. And one of your slogan, national slogan, is politics of survival. So you have experience living together with the bigger powers. So for the regional countries, we are facing the challenges from China and the potential China-US rivalry in the region. So what is the secret for Singapore's survival? That's the question for you. Okay, let's start from Ronnie.
So what on the ASEAN political and security community, is ASEAN doing enough? If not, how to improve it? I think ASEAN is starting to do the right things, and I think they don't have the, I don't know if it's confidence or, I think they're exploring their role. But the really good things are happening with ASEAN. I think you have the beginning of a genuine Asian security discussion that's in the core of the ADMM Plus. That's the ASEAN Defense Ministers Plus. It was only 10 years ago when the ASEAN defense ministers themselves actually wouldn't meet. That was too sensitive. The ASEAN chiefs of staff of the military were the ones that met. But now the defense ministers meet, the intelligence community meets together, and I think that's very positive. They also opened it up to ADMM Plus, so that's the ASEAN ministers plus the 8 other members of the East Asia Summit. That gathering of defense leaders is very, very significant. And this is, it's an example, Ravi, where I'll back up my argument. I think Singapore has been very sensitive about that at some points because they're trying to protect the Shangri-La dialogue, which they see as a meeting of global defense leaders. But I think Singapore's gotten over this, but there was initial caginess over that. So these little things slow down the potential role ASEAN can play. I think ASEAN also needs to have the confidence to have a vision. And Indonesia's last foreign minister, Marty Natalegawa, actually expressed a vision for an Indo-Pacific future. And I thought Marty was really stepping out, starting to articulate an Indonesian vision for a security and political future for Asia. That would be very powerful. But he didn't, I don't know, his time ran out, maybe. We could discuss that.
We do miss Marty a lot.
Yeah, exactly. But I think the rest of ASEAN, if we remember back to the forming of ASEAN in '67 and then how ASEAN actually worked, when Suharto would give an imperceptible nod to ideas, they would move forward. And it takes the Indonesians to lead. So, Ibu, I think we need Indonesian leadership in ASEAN to move forward on this front. The third point, don't fear being strategic. It's related to the second. ASEAN is very careful, very cautious, in a way that's part of its great value and part of why it's been successful. But I think too cautious, so cautious, as Ravi, I think, articulated and gave examples, so fearful of being, taking a side or not being neutral or getting involved in the major powers conflict, that it becomes, at times, irrelevant. And I think that's a mistake. And it doesn't only affect ASEAN, it affects the United States, it affects China, it affects Japan, India, all of us, everyone, global security. And then finally, I'll just reiterate a point that I made. The ASEAN political and security community, at the core of it, is the foundation of security and political integration and success is economics. So ASEAN has to have a vision where it cooperates on economics so that it can be strategic politically. And that's very important. I would like to see all of ASEAN join the TPP, and the members in TPP who are willing and able to commit, and Singapore, Malaysia, Brunei, and Vietnam, they should make a commitment to build on-ramps for the other ASEAN countries, and they should invest in the other ASEAN countries being able to build their capacity so that they can join TPP. And at the same time, I would say, even though the Americans aren't party to TPP or RCEP anymore, I would say drive a very high-quality RCEP so that RCEP and TPP are basically can dock into each other. But ASEAN needs to really step up on the economics, and that's what I mean by economics, driving economic integration to be the foundation of security.
Thank you. And Adriana?
May I firstly respond to your comment on actually about the regional leadership in ASEAN. When Suharto and Lee Kuan Yew were there, and together with Mahathir, so ASEAN really had a strong leadership. So let me say that the three musketeers can lead the region firmly. But now there's no single leader in ASEAN which can bring ASEAN to, let's say, to a new architecture, which can adjust or can respond properly, let's say, to Indo-Pacific or the Belt and Road Initiative. Indonesia is currently very busy taking care of all the domestic priorities, but it doesn't mean that Indonesia doesn't care about others or about ASEAN. Let's say in the case of Rohingya, I think it's clear that Indonesia is very responsible to take care of this issue. But again, until now, I personally cannot see who can actually lead ASEAN in this case. And to what you asked me about natural resource management in ASEAN, this is also related to the business and human rights, which I think Singapore has already the proposal on that. Or at least a few years ago, we had a study, baseline study to see how to implement business and human rights in ASEAN, because it's basically referring to the UN guidelines to respond to build responsible industry and company in the region. But in reality, this is still not in a good progress. what I may suggest is to assess socially and environmentally to any possibility that industry or company in the region can create something more dangerous, not only for the country but also for the whole region. So I'm actually doing now small research regarding the social and environmental impact assessment to see about how the government, how the business sector, and also the community are dealing with this case. But of course, this is not in progress because we just start this. So, but I just want to remind that ASEAN exists at least now already 50 years, but we don't know in the next 50 years. But again, ASEAN has a great achievement in terms of the institution. It has been the longest institution ever in this region compared to the previous one. And in terms of the membership, so almost the 10 countries in this region altogether, probably Timor-Leste is in queuing if possible, as Singapore, if you agree or not. And the last, I think, we probably don't realize that since ASEAN is there, so there is no any conflict or open conflict in the region. So in terms of maintaining peace and stability at the region, so this is clear for ASEAN. But again, back to what has been facing by ASEAN is not easy. Again, back to your questions, how Indonesia is going to be the regional leader. So let's see.
Okay, thank you so much. And Tansuri?
Oh yeah, thank you very much. I'll just, okay. But before I respond to your question, what did you mean by China revisionist? What exactly is China doing that's against the liberal international order?
Well, if you look at the sort of AIIB and the One Belt and One Road, I mean, I can't give you the detailed examples or instances, but I mean, it's not really out of my own assessment, but there's a kind of general perception shared by many people in this region that China is challenging existing regional order.
Yes.
And that my question was out of that kind
Okay.
of perception.
I agree with you. I think the existing regional order, as you know, especially the liberal international order, was essentially crafted by the United States and the Western powers. And it was crafted when they had the political power, balance of political power was with them. So when other powers rise, and if they see this international order as not advantageous to them or serving their interests, it just stands to reason that they will try to modify it. Now, China prospered very much from the liberal international order, we know that. If China wants to modify it, it won't, in my view, strike at the heart of the liberal international order. It will just shape it a little bit to suit its interests. For instance, it comes with the Belt Road Initiative. I don't see it as against the international order. I mean, other countries get together and China is doing something which actually is prospering other countries too, besides China, if you look at the economic aspect. So I don't see that as against the liberal international order. And as far as the regional institutions that China wants to build, I think it stands to reason that it will. So it is up to us to see whether that is undermining the fundamental values and principles of the liberal international order. I don't think so, because the present liberal international order is tilted towards the West, whether it's the World Bank or what's the other one? The consensus, Washington consensus.
Beijing consensus?
IMF. All, they're already being modified. So China will have greater say, and I think you have to give China greater say, as well as other countries that are rising. So that's on the liberal international order, China perspective. How we strengthen, I think we have to see how it goes and work, make sure that try as far as possible, the values and principles that ASEAN stands for which is in the ASEAN Charter, etc., which is the liberal international order, are observed as far as we can help. And so we get together with other countries, including US, and I believe China, to make it more equitable. More equitable, that's important. Now, coming to Zopwan, sorry, I didn't mean you remain neutral, when big powers collide in a negative sense. What I mean is, don't take sides with this power against that power. That's what I meant. But I did say we must douse embers, flickers, fires that start to come within our region. So we must try to moderate major power conflict. But I must tell you, it's not easy. Big powers do what they want to see this. So the US as well, they just do what they want when they think they have to, they go here, they go there. And what we have to make sure is China doesn't become, and China is already showing signs. I was at a meeting in Beijing, conference in Beijing a few years ago, and President Xi Jinping spoke about his version of liberal, a more just, maybe you were there too, more cooperative international order, less conflictual, adversarial. I supported it. Now, it's becoming just another major power. Thank you.
Okay, Ravi?
Yeah, thanks, Jaehyon. If you don't mind, I'm going to rephrase your question. You asked for Singapore wisdom. May I just turn it into Singapore experience? Because, I have a big northern neighbor sitting to my right and a bigger southern neighbor sitting on the same panel. So it's not right for me to be too wise because, Singapore's carried this impression of being know-it-all. And it's important for us to downplay our so-called wisdom. I'll talk about experience. Well, the first thing about Singapore is that our survival, what has been key to our survival is, we have a very strong defense. We are probably the strongest military in Southeast Asia. So the way we see it is that we are a prawn in this big sea, but if you swallow us, it's going to be a very poisonous prawn to swallow. I mean, that's the fundamental tenet of our strategic posture. You asked, how do we handle so many, the big power relationship? First thing is straight talk. We don't say one thing to one country and another thing to another country. Everybody knows. We go to China and we say it's important to keep the US here. We go to the US and say it's important to accommodate Chinese interests. And we bring in India. There's no ambiguity in anything we do. And the third thing is we stick to principles, and it comes with heavy costs. I'll tell you, at the birth, 1965, when under Sukarno we had Konfrontasi, we had bombings in Singapore, terrorist bombings. And government changed, Sukarno came in, and Sukarno asked for pardon for those two Marines who we caught. We went ahead and hanged them. And we suffered for 4 years, Thai suffered, but ultimately they came back to an even keel. With the United States in 1994, there was a young vandal called Michael Fay. He was 17 years old, or 18 years old in Singapore, and he was caught spray painting cars. And we are very strict on vandalism. We picked up the boy, and the court gave him 6 strokes of the cane. President Clinton intervened and said, look, spare the boy, it's a thing. Then 24 members of the Senate, that's a quarter of the Senate, wrote to President Ong Teng Cheong asking for clemency for this boy. We sort of tweaked it. We didn't give him 6 shots, we gave him 4. But we did go ahead, at the risk of losing our opportunity to host the inaugural summit of the WTO, which is a big thing for us. We are the most trade-dependent nation in the world, but we were willing to risk that privilege for a principle. And that is why we are not a claimant party in the South China Sea, where we stand up and say it's important to follow the rules of the road. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. We have 5 minutes until the break, and I guess this 5 minutes is just okay for 1, maybe 2 questions from floor. Anyone ask questions or comments to the panelists from the floor? Yes, please. First, identify yourself.
Hi, I'm CK from the ASEAN Korea Center in Seoul. Thank you very much all for your discussions. And I actually have a question about ASEAN centrality and also that relates to ASEAN's relations with its external dialogue partners. So just reflecting back a few weeks ago back in Australia when there was the ASEAN-Australia Special Summit, there was a buzz in Australia, the big debate about how Jokowi actually mentioned about Australia's membership in ASEAN and how it created a fuss. But obviously, speaking aside from the geographical issues that Australia is actually not part of Southeast Asia or anything, but do you think there is an important sense that as all these regional middle powers, or how we call it, the powers hedging between China and the US, is there a need for a greater sense of community in East Asia or in Asia Pacific, Indo-Pacific, whatever you would like to call it, but is there a need for a greater sense of community between ASEAN and also its dialogue partners that are still stuck between these two big superpowers, the US and China? What are your views on that?
Thank you. Anyone?
Can I?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. My question is also, who was telling President Jokowi about how Australia is going to be the member of ASEAN? I personally don't agree with that because ASEAN itself needs to consolidate how ASEAN is going to be a stronger region integration. And by having Australia in ASEAN, meaning that there are more problems will come. And in terms of economy, political, and also social, culture, lots of things must be adjusted. Honestly speaking, culturally, ASEAN is not homogeneous. So this is also part of the conflict actually happening in this region. And so I think there's no urgency for Australia to join ASEAN at the moment. Yeah.
Any other?
I would just say this, that, I think when you talk to the leaders of the ASEAN countries, and actually other powers that are not the United States or China, everybody wants balance. They don't want to be overbalanced by the Chinese rising and the Americans leaving. If it was, and I have to say, when I started my work in Southeast Asia in the mid-'80s, the Southeast Asians were in the United States asking for the United States to be more involved to balance the Japanese, who at that time were, really driving economic development, spending a ton of money. It was the Japan that could say no. And now it's the Chinese who are really pushing, and Southeast Asia is again seeking balance. I think the Australians, the Kiwis, Pacific nations, even the Indians are all seeking that balance. They don't want the Chinese to rise with ideas that impinge on their sovereignty. They want China to rise and be successful economically, but they want China to rise, be successful, and play by the international rules. And I think the Americans want that too. That's the truth. I mean, but what's happening is because ASEAN is more reticent, there's not unity there. You have other groups starting to form. So the Quad is a good example. Japan, Australia, India, the United States. Where's Korea in the Quad? I don't know. I don't understand why Korea was not invited to that personally. But you wouldn't need a Quad if ASEAN was really stepping up to some vision. And it's not a bad thing to say to China that we want you and we demand that you play by the rules. But the fact that the ASEAN hasn't held the Chinese to a real code of conduct in the South China Sea is just, that's all the evidence that you need, that the ASEAN is not unified. It's not stepping up to make that case. And I don't think, quite frankly, the Americans, the Japanese, the Koreans, anyone else has done enough to support ASEAN. But it's clear that the Chinese strategy to support Duterte and then undermine the Philippines' implementation of the Court of International Law's decision, arbitrational ruling against China, just to back away from that as Manila, is a great Chinese victory to undermine ASEAN's support for rule of law. But the ASEAN countries didn't all rush to the Philippines and support them when they won it under Aquino. So there's a long way to go. I think there is need for more community there. And this isn't an anti-China perspective by me at all. I think it's actually pro-China. We have to be honest with China and be consistent with China, and we have to be direct with China. Or as Ravi outlined, the Chinese will keep pushing until they find where the end is. And if there's no end, I think we'll all be sorry in the near future.
Thank you. I guess the time is up, and as a moderator, I don't want to sacrifice your break time with my final remark, and I would like to stop here. And would you please join me, give a big hand to our panelists? Thank you.